we are, of course, rapidly getting through this book just this week and next week, and then we will be finished with it. So, of course, this is a book we've seen that has unraveled with a series of surprises and secrets and revelations and like small details that we see can often turn out to be big moments and big turning points in this story. And in today's reading, we make another transition. Part 2 was told from whose perspective? Robbie's, right? Still third person, so it's not actually Robbie saying, I did this or I did that, but we see from his perspective, his thoughts, his ideas, his way of seeing the world. And then we now are into part 3 of the novel. Whose perspective are we seeing here? Back to Bryony, right? Who we saw was one of the major figures in part 1. Right? So in this part 3, do we have chapters like we did in part 1? No, right? The structure is the same as part 2, where we have sections instead of chapters, right? So only part 1 we see so far has chapters. Part 2, part 3 are single perspective, Robbie and now Bryony. Okay? So we saw how important those perspectives are, especially when we jumped from chapter to chapter, we jumped between different perspectives. Okay, now there are a lot of different things that are happening in today's reading. Right? Of course, we see that we leave off Robbie. He's still there in Dunkirk. He's sleeping. He's surviving. He's getting by. And then that narrative, just like part 1, ends. Right? Ends abruptly. And we jump again into part 3. Right? So just like we jumped from part 1 into part 2, now we have this jump again into part 3. And we see Bryony. It's also about 5 years later for her, isn't it, as well? Right? And we see that she's now become a nurse. We see certain things about her life. Right? And we see that she's begun to rethink some of the things that happened back in part 1. And in particular, that she's been writing about them and thinking about them. Now, what I want to focus my lecture on today has to do with the way in which McEwan gets us to think about what is the purpose of literature, right? What is it useful for? I mean, in some ways, from the outside, it can seem quite useless, right? We're reading a story that didn't happen. We're reading about characters that didn't exist. What seems the point of that? Why not read about real characters? Why read it all? Why not just do things like an engineer or a doctor? Why, right? What is the purpose? What is the function? What does literature do? And so this is one of the things that, as I said, McEwan is getting us to think about with regard to this novel. Right? Does literature have a place in the world? Does it have a function? What is its function? What can it do? Why should we study it? Is it practical? Is it just theoretical? All these kinds of questions are things that McEwan wants us to think about. Right? Of course, we have one of the central characters in Bryony is herself an author. Right? We know that she has these aspirations when she's very young to be a writer, and of course we're seeing the beginnings of her career as a writer during this part 3, where she's starting to write in a more sophisticated sort of way. She's starting to send out her work to magazines and to publications, and we also know from that flash forward in chapter 3 of part 1 that we know that she will go on to become an accomplished author. Also, we saw Cecilia and Robbie at Cambridge, also studying English literature. Right? So McEwan is interested in these questions. What is the purpose? Why do this? What is the function of writing a work of literature? Now, remember, we see different perspectives on this presented to us in the course of the novel. And I want to go back to some of those earlier ones and place it in the light of some of the things that we see here in part 3. So if you remember, in chapter 12 of our book, we have this chapter 12, like chapter 6, was a chapter that was told from the perspective of Emily Tallis, right? And Emily, if you remember, she thinks about her daughter Cecilia, and we talked about this in the context of gender before, of expectations for women and the roles of women. But now I want to take a look again at that same passage and to think about it in terms of the function of literature, right? What's the point of writing novels? What is it for? And if you remember, Emily seems very judgmental about Cecilia going off to Cambridge and studying English literature. Here's what she says. She says, but Cecilia, having learned modern forms of snobbery at Cambridge, in other words, she thinks, oh, just going and studying these things is just for rich snobs. It doesn't do anything, right? It just looks good, right? That's the idea. Considered a man with a degree in chemistry incomplete as a human being. Her very words. She had lolled about for 3 years at Girton, which is the college she was at in Cambridge, with the kinds of books she could equally have read at home. Jane Austen, Dickens, Conrad, all in the library downstairs in complete sets. How had that pursuit, reading the novels that others took as their leisure, let her think she was superior to anyone else? Even a chemist had his uses. So here we see a couple of different perspectives that are contained within this quotation. First of all, what Emily Tallis sees as being the function of literature is that for her, it's just entertainment, right? It's just something you do for fun, right? She says, well, you know, we have a library. You know, why couldn't she just stay home and read the books that we have in the library? Other people do that. And she said that, you know, others took as their leisure, right? In other words, just their pastime, for entertainment, for fun. Right? So this is Emily's view of what literature is for. Oh, it's just entertainment. It's just fun. Right? But if we go back earlier in that quote, some page 82 of your course packet, by the way. Look back earlier in the quote. Look what Cecilia says about what she thinks the function of literature is for her, right? She thinks that, and of course she's talking about Paul Marshall here. Paul Marshall has a degree in chemistry, which is why he's able to come up with this ultra cheap chocolate bar, the Ammo bar, right? He uses his skills there. She says she considered a man with a degree in chemistry incomplete as a human being. So for Cecilia, she has this very different vision than her mother as to what the function of literature is. Right? Whereas Emily just sees reading books, reading novels as being a form of entertainment. It's just for fun. It doesn't mean anything. Cecilia, by contrast, sees her studying of these works of literature as a way of developing herself as a person, right? Of finding out who she is, of working out what her values are, of thinking about her position in life, right? And so all these things that she's been studying, she sees as a way of creating her own personality, of becoming herself as a human being, right? So we can see these are two very different and contradictory almost approaches to what people think literature is about and what it does. And McEwen, at various points, brings both of these claims into question. Right? He's asked us, well, is literature just entertainment? Does it have no use? He also asks, does literature really make us better human beings? Does it make us complete? Does it really work in that way? Right? So he asks us questions about both of these assumptions. Emily's assumption is just entertainment. Cecilia's belief that it's a practice to make you a better, more complete human being. All right. Okay, now these ideas are in turn played out again with Robbie, right? And we can see that Robbie has his own ideas about, what the function of literature is and how important it is to him, and what kind of practical purposes he thinks that it has. So, for instance, we see that on the one hand, Robbie is not like Emily, right? He doesn't think that English literature, studying literature, is just something that is for entertainment, right? He gets it, right? He understands why, for him, literature would be important, right? He's read all of these works. He understands them. He got a first at Cambridge, right? Top grades. He loves, the works that he has. Remember, he collects, some special editions of some works, right? Some of them quite expensive, right? And he's passionate about it. However, for him, there is a kind of back and forth between what he thinks about literature. Sometimes he sees it as being crucial, at other times he wonders, is it really practical? Is it really worthwhile? And he goes back and forth between these two different positions. So this is back in chapter 8 of part 1, on page 48 of the course packet, where Robbie is thinking through his future, and he's decided that even though he's done this degree in English literature, he is going to become a doctor. Right? So, despite his first, the study of English literature seemed in retrospect an absorbing parlor game, and reading books and having opinions about them the desirable adjunct to a civilized existence. But it was not the core, whatever Dr. Leavis said in his lectures. It was not the necessary priesthood, nor the most vital pursuit of an inquiring mind, nor the first and last defense against the barbarian horde, any more than the study of painting or music, history or science. At various talks in his final year, Robbie had heard a psychoanalyst, a communist trade union official, and a physicist each declare for his own field as passionately, as convincingly as Leavis had for his own. Such claims were probably made for medicine, but for Robbie, the matter was simpler and more personal. His practical nature and his frustrated scientific aspirations would find an outlet. He would have skills far more elaborate than the ones he had acquired in practical criticism. Right. So here we see some of the claims that Robbie comes up against that are made for the importance of literature, that he then dismisses, right? So he says things like, is literature the most important thing, the most important study in life? So, no, right? It's equally possible to study music or philosophy or science or any of these other things, right? That could be equally valuable to working out who you are as a human being, right? So he rejects this idea. He also rejects the idea that it's the cornerstone of English civilization, right? As if if you got rid of this, if you stopped studying literature, somehow we would all turn into barbarians and we'd all act like sort of backward cavemen, right? So Robbie is skeptical about the idea that we see earlier from Cecilia, right, that we saw in the last quote. Right? He's skeptical that it's necessary to study literature in order to become a fully rounded human being. Instead, he says there are many paths, there are many possibilities, there are many different ways that you could go through life that could be fulfilling, that could make you a great human being, and that could teach you about these things. Now, you notice here he mentions this Dr. Leavis, right? And if you're not familiar with this name, it looks like he's just maybe one of Robbie's professors at Cambridge, right? But it's not, right? It's actually the name of a very famous critic. The critic's name is F.R. Leavis. F.R. Leavis. Right? Very influential 20th century critic. Died in 1978. So this period that we're seeing of the 1930s and the 1940s is when Leavis is the most active and the most, sort of at the height of his fame. And one of the key arguments that Leavis made about literature, and particularly English literature, was that he argued the exact same position that Cecilia does, which is that studying literature is key, the core, the most important thing for developing ourselves both as a human being and also collectively as people, right, as a society. Right? So Leavis makes a very big claim here. Right? He was quite successful in it. That's why English literature became gradually so popular during the 20th century, where previously it was disciplines like classics. Right? Studying the Greek and Roman classics were far more popular in, say, the 19th century. But in the 20th century, we have a lot more study and a lot more prevalence of literature, English literature in particular. So Leavis makes these claims in the 20th century. He champions English literature as a discipline. And he's very successful in getting it institutionalized within the university. But McEwan, as we see through Robbie, as we see through other moments, he is somewhat skeptical about these, what he seems to him, over-the-top claims for what literature can do. Can it really just make you into a good person? Can it really make you into a wonderful human being? Especially because we see, in terms of the context of atonement, right? One of the most, as we talked about last time, one of the most ethical, one of the most good characters is Robbie. And he chooses to become a doctor, not to pursue literature, not to go beyond his degree. And by contrast, who would you think would be the most ethically flawed character that we've met? Well, who commits the crime? Bryony, right? And what is Bryony wanting to do? Yeah, she's wanting to be an author, right? So she wants to pursue her studies in writing literature. So even within the contrast between those two characters, we can see McEwan is already drawing some questions here, right? About, well, literature, yes, we can see it does have certain functions, certain ways in which it can, develop us as human beings. But is it inevitably going to make, like, if you take someone and teach them literature, is it going to make them necessarily into a good person? McEwan says, wait a minute, that seems a bit over the top, right? It seems a bit extravagant to make a claim like that. Now, one other reason I think that McEwan has for mentioning Leavis here is that one of the most famous and enduring sort of debates that he was involved in was something called the Two Cultures debate in the 1950s and 60s, with a novelist and also physicist by the name of C.P. Snow. Right? And C.P. Snow talked about how there seemed to be this division, this separation between the way in which people in the sciences think and the way that people in the humanities think. Right? And remembering that C.P. Snow was someone who was trained in both physics and also was a novelist. Right? So he was someone who was able to straddle, able to cover both sides of this. And his argument was really, we need more interaction, we need more, we need each side to learn from the other in a meaningful way. And McEwan is someone who himself has written extensively and talked extensively about how he's very interested in science as well as literature. Of course, he's a novelist. That's his first love and his first way of looking at the world. But nonetheless, he says that his fiction is strongly influenced by ideas from science and mindsets that come to him from science. And so in various of his novels, he has looked at this question of like science versus humanities, right? So in his second to last novel that he published, Solar, in 2010, for example, has a Nobel Prize-winning physicist as its main character. He's a horrible character. He's a very selfish and mean and greedy kind of character who has no time at all for literature. When he was, there's a scene in the book where he wanted to sleep with this other student, like when he was a student himself, right? And he was a physics major and she was an English major. And he knew what she was studying, so he went and read all the books that she was reading, and he uses this knowledge, quotes poetry to her, seduces her. She later marries him, and it doesn't work out. And he's like, this literature stuff, it's easy, child's play, nothing, it's not as hard as physics. Anyone can read this stuff, right? Now, in some ways, he's quite right? Anyone can pick up a copy of Atonement and read it and understand it. But one of the things about Michael Beard, that character, that main character of Solar, is that he can understand it up here, but he is exactly like what Cecilia described about Paul Marshall. He's someone that hasn't learned to be a real human being, right? He's someone who is lonely, who is greedy, who is unhappy, and doesn't really know how to live his life properly, right? So he may be able to read these works of literature, but for him to really grasp what they're talking about in terms of what it means for life, for thinking about developing ourselves as human beings, that character of Michael Beard doesn't understand it at all, right? And we get similar characters like this, although perhaps not as sort of extreme as Michael Beard as protagonists of a couple of his other novels. Saturday, which I mentioned before, is the novel that takes place over the course of one day, and the main character of that is a neurosurgeon, Henry Perrone, right? And he is, again, a very rational, very scientific kind of guy, but he has a daughter who is a poet, and she keeps getting him to try and read all these novels, and he reads, Anna Karenina, Charles Dickens, yeah, it's just pretty stories, I don't get it, right? And he doesn't understand at all the function, the purpose of literature. He doesn't understand even his own daughter, why she is writing all this poetry, right? And he remains in some ways underdeveloped as a human being. And then lastly, as I mentioned there, I've mentioned a couple of times, Enduring Love as well. That's the one with the hot air balloon. And its main character, Joe Rose, is a science journalist, right? So he's writing about the latest developments in science. And he has also great contempt for the humanities and literature, and says, it's just all just a waste of time, all just nonsense. But then has to face up to some real life problems of his own that he has to solve, very often using narrative techniques. So there is built into, not only into like McEwan's interest as a novelist from these other works and also in Atonement, these are in many ways reflections of the broader values of the way in which society and our cultures tend to see the world. It's the same in Korea, it's the same in pretty much all the world, where science, engineering, especially here at Hanyang, right, is valued, seen as more important, seen as more practical than humanities, than literature. And no literature scholar, I'm not denying that those things are important, right? We need engineers, we need scientists, we need all those people, we need doctors and so on, right? But at the same time, there is also a need, if you're going to be a good human being, to study these ideas and values of what literature can offer. It's not inevitable, though. Reading a book, studying literature is not necessarily, like Lever's claims, going to make you a good person. Not necessarily going to make you fulfilled as a human being, right? But it has that potential to do this. So the overall picture that we get in Atonement of this question is actually quite complicated, right? I mean, it wouldn't make sense for Ian McEwan just to say, oh, all novels are rubbish, you know, it's not worth doing. I mean, he's writing novels himself. Obviously, he thinks they're valuable, right? There's something valuable about writing them. So what is his positioning? Right. Well, he's wanting us to be more realistic on the one hand. He doesn't want us to follow simply like the old sort of Levis-style arguments that, oh, studying literature will never inevitably make you better. It is the cornerstone of our culture. It is all these things that are so important. Because McEwan says, as he does through Robbie, there are other things in life that can make you fulfilled, that can lead you on a satisfying path, that can develop you as a human being. However, it is possible for literature to be that path and to do these things, right? It is possible, but it is not inevitable. And so I want to demonstrate this by two contradictory statements that occur, one from our reading and one from earlier in part 2. So this one is from page 144 of our reading from today. And this is towards the end of Robbie's section. And he says there, no one at Cambridge taught the benefits of good marching order. They revered the free, unruly spirits, the poets. But what did the poets know about survival? So here, Robbie seems to go back to this idea that I like studying literature, but it wasn't practical. Right? I wanted to do something more practical. Okay? So he seems to go back to that idea and say, oh, well, okay, you know, poetry, it's wild, it's fun, but ultimately not practical. However, this is contradicted by something we saw much earlier in part 2. Right? Which is, remember, Robbie is wounded. He has shrapnel in his leg. Right? Shrapnel is like bits of metal, like when a bomb explodes, right? The bits of metal that explode outwards, you know, they can fly and shrapnel can, so bits of metal that can embed themselves in your body and your skin and so on, right? So he's got some shrapnel in his leg, so he's wounded, he's a bit delirious, and we see that he starts to use some of the skills, some of the knowledge that he learned while he was an English major at Cambridge. Right? This passage is on page 118 of your course packet. It says, so here he is, he's walking along, and he's on the edge of exhaustion, and this is how he approaches it. Each step was a conscious decision, right? So normally when we walk, we walk without thinking about it, right? But he is so wounded, he's so exhausted. All right, I've got to make next step, right? Each step was a conscious decision. A blister was swelling on his left heel, which forced him to walk on the edge of his boot. Without stopping, he took the bread and cheese from his bag, but he was too thirsty to chew. He lit another cigarette to curb his hunger and tried to reduce his task to the basics. You walked across the land until you came to the sea. What could be simpler once the social element was removed? He was the only man on earth and his purpose was clear. Is he the only man on earth? No, he's not, right? He's pretending here. Right? He was the only man on earth and his purpose was clear. He's walking across the land until he came to the sea. The reality was all too social, he knew. Other men were pursuing him, but he had comfort in a pretense and a rhythm, at least for his feet. He walked across the land until he came to the sea. Right? So he's turned this sentence into a poem. 5 I ams, which, as you heard me reading it there, is da 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 da. This is the rhythm, the beat, right? So unstressed, stressed, da 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 da. He walked across the land until he came, and then the last one is a style called an anapest, to the sea. Right? So 5 I ams and an anapest was the beat he tramped to now. So in the previous quote that we looked at, Robbie says, at Cambridge, they didn't teach me anything useful. Like, how is learning poetry going to help me to survive? How is it going to be anything practical? It's not good for being in the army. What could it teach you about marching? And yet, when we look back at this passage, we can actually see that actually Robbie's study of poetry does actually save his life, right? When he's walking along and he's trying to find the motivation to keep going, right? He pretends. He uses his imagination. I'm in a fiction. I'm the only man left alive, and I'm walking to the sea. I'm the only man left alive, and I'm walking, right? This is his imagination that he's using. He blocks out the war. He blocks out all the things that are around him, and he pretends, he imagines, creates this fictional scenario, right? That makes it so that he is so he's pretending, like in a work of fiction. And then secondly, as we saw at the end there, he turns these words of him walking to the sea, he turns it into a poetic line that he repeats over and over, right? So it provides him with this rhythm that allows him to just sort of hypnotically keep on walking and keep on staggering towards Dunkirk, towards the sea. So McEwan, when we're trying to work out what exactly he thinks, right? Well, at certain points he seems to say, well, there's no point in literature. He has characters who say, it's just entertainment, it's just fun, it's just a game, right? It's not really all that important. But then we see other moments where we see that contradicted by the thoughts and by the behavior, and of course by the fact that we are reading a novel. Right? We're reading a work of fiction. So obviously McEwan must think that it is worthwhile. Right? Otherwise, why would he even bother to write a novel? So it's a complicated picture we get of this question of the value of literature. Now, we also see, in addition to those practical things that Robbie does, of tricking himself, imagining himself that he's the last man alive, of using the poetic beat, right, to organize his marching. He also draws inspiration in part 2 from the poetry that, first of all, Cecilia sends to him, right? So the Auden poem that we've talked about, and also briefly mentioned a couple of lines from A. Housman, another English poet from the late 19th century. And these are things, remember, that give him hope that after he comes back from the war, he'll be able to marry Cecilia, have children with her, become a father himself, right? All those things that we've talked about previously in part 2. Right? So he constructs this, again, this narrative, this story, this fiction about himself that draws from the strategies of literature, right? And he uses it in order to survive, right? So this idea that Cambridge taught him nothing useful to help him survive in the army is blatantly contradicted by his actual behavior in part 2. So we have to be careful when we're thinking about this question with regard to Ian McEwan, right? He is wanting to look at, yes, there are certain things, certain ways in which literature is useful to us. It has certain things, ways that it can be used as a tool, right? But it is not a tool that is inevitable in its application. It will not necessarily turn you into a good person. It will not necessarily fulfill you as a human being. There are other possible paths that might do this, but literature can do this. It's possible. Now, I want to close my part of the lecture today with finally thinking about Bryony and how she, again, in a rather over-the-top, exaggerated way, comes to think that her fiction and the new modern style of fiction that she's seeing around her and that's being published is going to change, revolutionize the world around her. Right? Now, remember I said to you that this book, Atonement, borrows from a number of different authors. We've seen borrowing from Shakespeare, from D.H. Lawrence, and I've already mentioned a few times Virginia Woolf, right? And I said particularly the style of chapters 6 and 12 in part 1. And those are the chapters where we see Emily Tallis, right? Remember Emily Tallis, her perspective in those chapters is presented to us as a kind of stream of consciousness, right? We just see her thoughts and memories, and her thoughts just sort of wander across different ideas that she has. This is very much the same style that Virginia Woolf has, right? And we see here, in turn, Bryony, in this passage here, she has been reading Virginia Woolf, right? Remembering that Virginia Woolf is still alive during the time that Bryony is, being portrayed here, right? And she's read Virginia Woolf, and she thinks that these new modern writers that she's seeing, like Woolf, are going to completely revolutionize, completely change the way in which the modern world works, completely change how human beings think and behave. Right. Let's see what she says about this. This is on page 151 of the course packet. What excited her about her achievement was its design, the pure geometry and the defining uncertainty which reflected, she thought, a modern sensibility. Of course, she's talking here about her story that she's written. Remember, she mentions this in her earlier letter to Robbie about how Bryony has been doing some writing and she's been submitting stuff to magazines and so on. So she says, the age of clear answers was over. Right? And remembering this is a novel that's full of ambiguities, uncertainties. So was the age of characters and plots. Despite her journal sketches, she no longer really believed in characters. They were quaint devices that belonged to the 19th century. The very concept of character was founded on errors that modern psychology had exposed. Plots were like rusted machinery whose wheels would no longer turn. A modern novelist could no more write characters and plots than a modern composer could a Mozart symphony. It was thought, perception, sensations that interested her. The conscious mind is a river running through time, and how to represent its onward roll, as well as all the tributaries that would swell it, and the obstacles that would divert it. If only she could reproduce the clear light of a summer's morning, the sensations of a child standing at a window, the curve and dip of a swallow's flight over a pool of water. The novel of the future would be unlike anything in the past. She had read Virginia Woolf's The Waves 3 times and thought that a great transformation was being worked in human nature itself. And that only fiction, a new kind of fiction, could capture the essence of the change. To enter a mind and show it at work or being worked on, and to do this within a symmetrical design, this would be an artistic triumph. Now, these are the basic template of a lot of modernist novels, right? They try to do this rather than showing us characters, showing us plots, right? Instead, they very often try to capture moments, sensations, feelings, perceptions, right? And they also show us a way of the characters thinking, that stream of consciousness style, which is not sort of neat and ordered and sort of artificial, but rather attempts to show the actual real way. Of course, it still is artificial, but attempts to show the real way in which characters actually think, or human beings actually think. Now, think about this for a moment, right? Remember, this is 1940, right, at the time that this is being portrayed, roughly, right? Bryony is now 18, right? So it's about 1940, 5 years after Part 1, just like Part 2 was, okay? And we see here, what year was this novel Atonement published? 2001, right? Now, remember here, there's a certain historical irony that McEwan is using in this passage, right? Here we have Bryony talking about the novel of the future and what it's going to be like and what the future will bring. Now, Atonement is also a novel, from her point of view, of the future, isn't it? Right? It's a novel that will, McEwan will write 60 years later. Does he have a plot? Does Atonement have a plot? It does, doesn't it? Right? There are things happening here. There's a beginning, there's a middle and end, right? There are certain jumps that are made, but it has a plot. Does it have characters? Very much so, right? So there's a kind of irony here that Bryony is saying, the novel of the future, this new future kind of novel, it won't have characters, it won't have a plot, it'll be something completely unimaginable. And yet here along comes McEwan and he writes a novel that has a plot, that has characters, that does all these things. At the same time as it is aware of these new innovations of the modernist Virginia Woolf style. Okay. So McEwan, whenever we see statements, as we've seen all the way through the novel, we always have to take them, as the English phrase goes, with a grain of salt. We can't believe them just at face value, right? We can't just take them, oh, really, that's the reality it is. Remember, this is one perspective, right? And McEwan actually, in an essay that he wrote, talks about the way in which Virginia Woolf holds sort of similar ideas as to what Bryony expresses here, right? And he says, well, there are certain ways in which our culture changes, but there are also certain things that don't change or that take thousands and thousands of years to change, right, about human nature. And he gives some examples from, for example, from Homer's The Odyssey, which is, nearly 3,000 years, written 3,000 years ago, right? And he says, we can understand and relate to the things that happen in Homer's Odyssey. When Odysseus comes home and sees his wife and sees the things that have been going on in his house, right? We can understand his feelings. Right? So there are certain things obviously that have changed since Homer's time in those 3,000 years, but there are also certain things that haven't changed. Right? And, this is something that McEwan is saying, that those basics of human nature, of human behavior, literature isn't going to change those at a fundamental level. Right? It's not going to change them at a fundamental level. So we have this question that McEwan leaves us with. Right? On the one hand, we have seen in this novel, through Robbie, through Bryony, through Cecilia, through Emily, we've seen different perspectives on how literature can be valued. Right? We've seen that sometimes it's seen as just entertainment. Sometimes it's seen as being, as Levis puts it, the core, the cornerstone of culture. McEwen, rather more realistically, gets us to think, well, you know, there are times, there are moments, there are things for which literature is important. It can be useful, but that use is not inevitable. It will not necessarily create a great culture, make a great person, make you fulfilled as a human being. But it is one tool, one path, one way, one potential way of doing this. Okay. So whenever we see these things, just like all the other things that we come across in the novel, always take these things very carefully with a grain of salt, with care, right? Because everything that we see here, everything that is presented to us, right, in this novel, we have seen has tended to be loaded with some kind of bias, right? Whether it's Robbie's bias against Bryony when he reveals certain things about the swimming lessons she has, or whether it's Emily Tallis's bias about about her daughter and the kinds of roles that she thinks that a woman should have. Whatever it is, we've got to be very cautious about taking these ideas at face value. Okay, well, we're out of time for today. Thank you, guys, and we'll continue with part 3 next time. Remember, coming up next week, next Monday, we'll be talking about the format and the style and the questions that will be on the midterm exam. And then 2 weeks from today, we'll be taking the midterm exam in here at this time, usual time. So be ready for that.